Who had grandparents fight in World War II and what stories did they share? Grandfather was in an amphibious division in the Pacific Theater. He left us with little snippets of his time. A camp was pitch black because they didn't want to be visible from above. A guy in his cabin went to the outhouse and sat down to do his business when he heard something. He pulled his lighter out and lit it. A python was dangling down, staring him in the face. He and another man were walking on a beach and the other guy just got shot through the head from a sniper. That sniper's decision led to my existence. General MacArthur showed up and gave him a promotion along with a few others. They took a video of MacArthur shaking the hands of a line of soldiers and used it for a pro-American propaganda film to be played before movies in the US. My grandma saw it and freaked the F out, and the theater owners gave her a copy of the photo. Navy PR makes a lot of people think the Pacific was all Marines when in reality the Army had over 5 times as many divisions deployed there. The fighting the Army did under MacArthur against the vanguard of the EA in the Philippines and New Guinea campaigns were brutal. A lot of people don't know that the Army had the unfortunate honor of defeating the largest Japanese banzai assault in history, and also for deploying paratroopers to airdrop onto a tiny contested island. The war was crazy huge, but it seems like we only ever read about D-Day, the Bulge, and Iwo Jima. Yep, it was indeed huge. Every place, village, town, forest, water where combat happened has horrible stories and disasters to tell. My grandfather was in the resistance in Holland. He never spoke about the war to his wife, children or grandchildren. If asked to relate stories, he'd reply, "I will not be responsible for the nightmares of another," would turn his hearing aid off, and nap in his chair. My Opa never spoke of the war either. He was sent to the work camps. He returned once somehow on foot but was sent back. Oma didn't speak of the war, but right up to her death in 1990s, she would spit if she saw a German. My uncles only remembered the starvation and that they mustn't talk. They were too young for anything else to stick. My grandfather only spoke of the war when I asked him once to do a presentation at school when I was about 11 years old. Never knew until that day he and his family were hiding multiple Jews up in their barn in Brabant for the course of 2 years. I have never seen 30 11 to 12-year-olds listen to someone for that long. I still remember all of it. I don't think we can actually imagine, even though we've all watched movies and stuff. My Opa was captured right before the end of the war and was sent to a camp. He had a number on his forearm that none of us ever saw until after his death, in a photograph. He wore long sleeves no matter the weather. No one knows why he wasn't gunned down on the spot. The camp was liberated a week or so after he got there. My Oma knew the gist of it but no details. They were married shortly after the war, and I'm told she had no idea until later. He worked at a shipbuilding company and was often gone weeks at a time. We found out about most of these things from people his age after he died. Mind-boggling. My grandfather was also in the resistance in Holland, as was my great-grandfather, who was some kind of general in the regular Dutch army and chose to stay when the king and queen fled. My grandpa wrote his memoirs before he died but barely wrote anything about the war other than it was cold, he was always hungry, and he got very sick. Paternal Opa was a Dutch Marine in Rotterdam at the start. I was stupid enough to ask about it when I was 15. Needless to say, I now know what a 1,000-yard stare looks like. Later on, I did get a few details though. After the capitulation, they were held in a school, and forced into policing duties. He managed to jump the fence somehow. Later when he got home, they sent a few soldiers for him. He said they came late in the evening, and he was sitting right outside the back door in the dark. Could have grabbed the gun of one of them, but chose not to. Sounded like he meant I could have won too. He joined the NS later as a conductor, so when the big strike came, he went into hiding. During that time while working in the field, he saw someone come down from the sky dangling on a parachute. Just pointed him to the nearest trustworthy farm, not much else he could do, what with the Germans racing towards them. Maternal Oma was a teen during the bombings of Rotterdam. She got evacuated to North Groningen in the Hunger Winter. Lost a brother to the Arbeitsloggers. Neither one of them ever actually talked about the carnage bits. None at all. My grandpa went to Europe as a teenager, and it must have been messed up because he never talked about his experience all the way up to his death. He came back with 3 medals and nobody in the family knows what he did to get them. My dad's father was the same. He served but didn't talk about it. My mom's dad served in the Korean War. Dude was a boxing champ in the Navy and happily talked about whatever you wanted. I feel like the Navy would have been a very different experience than the infantry. My grandfather re-enlisted to serve in the Korean War, and I still get chills when I remember the time he casually mentioned I haven't been warm since Korea. Same, my grandfather was a Marine in the Pacific. Never wanted to talk about it. My dad said when he asked his dad if he should sign up and go to Vietnam, Grandpa said he'll know. Only go if they force you. Never knew my pappy was in Vietnam until a couple years ago, so I never asked him questions. Thought he kept it that way for some reason. Similar experience here, my grandfather was awarded the Silver Star and his kids, my dad/uncle, didn't know about it until they saw the engraving on his tombstone. Clearly had lots of memories that he never wished to relive, God rest his soul. Same, but he did give me his dog tags. He said they must be good luck because he didn't die while he was wearing them. He was in Europe. My father served in Vietnam, and I didn't even know he had been there until my mid-20s, always thought a work injury had kept him out of the draft. He doesn't talk about it, I don't ask about it. This is similar to my experience with my father. Whenever I asked him about what he did to earn the Bronze Star, with valor, he always just said stupidity. He had the European, American and Pacific Theater ribbons among so many others, including 2 Purple Hearts. His most prized, though, was always the SIB. My grandfather too. We knew he was in the war, but he never spoke of it. Both my grandfathers served in the U.S. Army Air Force. One was a waist gunner on a B-17. He caught some shrapnel from a German AA gun one mission and almost bled out on the return trip. While he was in the hospital, his plane was shot down. The other was an MP who would tell us about busting heads in bars. My grandfather was a flight engineer/top turret gunner on the B-17. He was very tight-lipped about his service. I joined the army after he had passed, and my aunt gave me an album of pictures from his time in Europe. It was pretty eye-opening to his experiences. My grandfather was a navigator in a B-17. Unfortunately, any stories of his have come from my father. One was the pilot getting pissed at my grandfather for putting armored plates by where he sat because it added extra weight to the plane and he didn't want to crash on takeoff. My grandfather was a B-17 pilot involved in the bombing of Dresden, I think. He only told me once, and that was 30 years ago. He was pretty tight-lipped about his time in the service. Even his kids, my father and his siblings, don't know a whole lot about his service. Unfortunately, my grandfather burned everything, including his diary from that time, due to dementia and thinking the government was after him. And my father doesn't like to think about it because he was out of the country when my grandfather passed, which is a pretty painful memory for him. So any details from my grandfather's time in World War II are pretty much lost. My grandfather was a tail gunner on a B-17. I think he also had a bombing run on Dresden. He was shot down in July of 1943. He bailed out. Germans were waiting for him when he hit the ground. Spent 9 months in a German POW camp. Escaped on a march when the Germans started consolidating the camps. Found a British tank regiment that got him back to a hospital in London. He told me a lot about his time in the war. Still broke out in a cold sweat when he visited the 8th Air Force Museum in Georgia though. Great uncle also fought in the Pacific. He is CH.1 in Killing the Rising Sun. Sacrificed himself by covering a grenade that was tossed into his unit. Died a few days later on a hospital ship. My grandpa was a B-17 pilot, got in 1943, and get sent to Europe literally right before D-Day. By all accounts he should have died and I should have never been here. My paternal grandfather landed on Omaha on D-Day. That's it, that's all he ever shared. We know he spent the duration of the war in Europe, but whatever he saw or did was too much to ever tell my grandmother, dad, aunt or uncle. I think my granddad landed 2 or 3 days after D-Day and he never talked to me about it until a few months before his death. He recalled arriving on the beach and having to cross over the bodies of the fallen soldiers. It deeply affected him. Having him share just a few stories with me before he died this year felt like such an honor, as he never shared much with anyone about this time. Edit. For those curious, my granddad was a sergeant in the 554th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. He also participated in the Battle of the Bulge and was awarded a Bronze Star for his service. Same. My grandpa never said anything about the war until a few months before he died. All he mentioned was that he had a dream about a young man he shot. It turned out that he was a first scout in the U.S. Army and was instrumental in liberating a sub-camp of Buchenwald, Ohrdruf. No one besides my grandmother had any idea until we read his obituary. My neighbor growing up said he landed a week after D-Day. He told me some stories, but he never talked about getting there. Not a grandparent, but my M53 father-in-law. My wife and I started dating in HS and she was the only person in our group who had a World War II vet as a parent. Everyone else was much younger. He was in the Army in the South Pacific. He would not speak of his experience. He passed away 8 years ago. It was only after his death did we discover he had been awarded 2 Bronze Stars during that time. It would have been interesting to know the circumstances. My great-grandpa hit the beach a couple days after the initial push. He was artillery, which left him mostly deaf. He didn't willing talk about it much but did share some things with my older brother a couple years before he died for one of my brother's college assignment. Being artillery, they were never at the front line but a little back shooting over our line to their line. I'm told that he said some of the most important things were socks and blankets and that it was normal to take the socks or boots off dead soldiers as the line moved forward if you needed new ones. He had a Bronze Star on his record but I can't find documentation as to why, but it is on his DD 214. Almost the same with my grandpa. A few stories he shared right before he died were horrific, things he'd had to do. I think he needed to get things off his chest that he'd bottled up. He suffered terribly and had bad PTSD, tried to hide it from us. Very brave man. I've got a relative that was in Normandy and never once spoke about it. He's 10 years past now, and was the gentlest person I've ever known. I wish I knew what he experienced, but I feel like there's a damn good reason he never spoke about it. My grandfather was in the Pacific in a chemical regiment. The only thing we know is that he manned a flamethrower. The Japanese would dig tunnels and occupy caves in the Pacific Islands. Rather than invading the tunnels and caves, which would have meant certain death, they would take a flamethrower and shoot it into the cave. The result would be that it would consume the oxygen down there and whoever would suffocate or run out into the open and straight into the flamethrower. He never talked about any of it. In my old age, my great-uncle who served in Korea started telling his stories after his mind was going. He never said much specifically, but he did mention how he basically was on the front lines and saw combat and how he was picked on due to his religion. My mom was awestruck because he always told us he was just a typist, took notes on a typewriter type deal, and that's all he ever told his family. I'm pretty sure he saw some gnarly crap and just never wanted to talk about it. Yeah, my great-grandfather was in Normandy. I never met him, but from what I've heard he was an incredibly brave man. He managed to escape on a fishing boat. We don't know the full story, but afterwards he was shipped to Egypt. My grandpa said he had severe PTSD from it and didn't speak of it much. My maternal great-grandfather had fought on D-Day. I think he was in the second wave, but I need to ask my grandma later about it. I never met him, as he died when my mom was in college. Grandfather was a U.S. sniper in the Pacific. One of the best stories was of a cocky officer who showed up and lined all the infantry up on the beach to tell them they were a bunch of pansies and he was going to whip them into shape. These men had been seeing hand-to-hand combat for months. The officer finally said, "If there's a man on this beach that thinks he can whip my ass, take one step forward." Every man took a step forward immediately. The officer didn't say much after that. We had something like that happen after my first deployment. The whole company got together and we were able to call out anyone for a grappling match. One of our SSGs called out our company commander, who was possibly insane and was not entirely loved by the company. The CO whipped the absolute crap out of the SSG lol. Well, that didn't go as planned, ha ha ha. Depending, it might have gone exactly as planned. Oh, that's classic. That would make an excellent scene in a movie. My grandfather worked military intelligence, or something like that. He was a polyglot. He spoke more languages than I honestly know. The ones I know he spoke were relevant to his work in the Pacific War. He spoke Japanese, Mandarin, Tagalog, Korean and a few others. He also spoke Norwegian, German and a few others. I only know one story of him seeing action. Apparently at some point some guys captured a Japanese officer alive. Grandpa said that was rare, guys would rather kill themselves than be caught alive. Grandpa was escorted up to the pillbox where this guy was captured and being held. They were afraid to move him from the area, afraid he'd get killed if they saw him alive. Grandpa went in, and he tortured that man for information. When he came out he said he was walking back to his Jeep and felt a tug at his ear. He reached up, and his hand came away a bloody mess, and his ear was on the ground in front of him. Grandpa said has no idea how he made it back to camp, but they found his Jeep a mile or so away riddled with bullet holes. Apparently the Japanese chose to attack right when my grandpa was leaving, and a bullet tore his ear clean off. Said he never knew the names of the guys who protected his dumb ass while he picked up his ear and walked over, started his Jeep and drove off. The Jeep was full of holes and stopped working as he got near to safety, and he apparently walked the rest of the way back holding his ear in his hand. He got the ear sewn back on, had a massive knot of scar tissue to show for it and a purple heart. That's the only story I ever heard from my grandpa about his time in the Pacific War. I honestly don't know how accurate it all is. He only told me once 30 years ago when he was drunk, and I was 8 years old. He went on to serve in Korea and I think Vietnam, but I could be wrong. My grandpa allegedly did the same thing but in Europe with Nazis. Same deal, polyglot, and nicely asked prisoners to spill the beans. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please like them on YouTube. And share them with your friends. Please subscribe to be the first to know about Red Rabbit Reader's new videos. We welcome your comments below. Another of our videos will begin shortly.